Okay, class. So I welcome you back to another important lecture. And for today, we will see another aspect of the transport in plant. And in that, we would be talking with context to the xylem vessels. Like if I were to recall some of the things, so I said that whenever we have to be doing the transportation in plant, then we would need the vascular bundles. And among the vascular bundles, we have the xylem and we have the phloem. The phloem we saw earlier that it was translocating the sucrose and the amino acid up and down the plant. Now, for today's class, we will see that how come the xylem vessels, that is another vascular bundle with us, how this would be transporting the water and the ions from the root to the stem and then finally into the leaves of the plant. Now, if I were to show you the general scheme of how the water would be moving, so this is the basic flow chart that I have got for you. So the water would be available and the ions would be available in the soil. From there, they would move into the root hair cells. Once they come into the root hair cells, then the water they would move by diffusion and osmosis in the root cortex, and then they would come to the xylem of the root. And from the xylem of the root, they would go into the xylem of the stem, and from there we would bring it to the xylem of the leaves, and then from the leaf xylem, the water would be moving into the spongy mesophyll cells and the palisade mesophyll cells. But some of the water would evaporate from the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells and it would come into the air spaces that we have in the spongy mesophyll cells. And from there, we would cause the water molecules to diffuse through the stomata into the external environment. And this is what we would be referring to this as a transpiration process. And we will see in a while that why this is necessary for the transpiration to happen. Like if I would not cause the water molecules to escape from the air spaces that we have in the spongy mesophyll cells to the external environment, then we can't pull the water up the stems. Like if I were to show you from the diagrams what I said here, like the basic scheme that how we would be moving the water. So if you were to see here, here we have got with us is the external soil, okay? And we have got these water and ions. Now I would move the water into the root hair cell first. Then from here the water would go into this part of the root that we have here, and this is the root cortex, and from there it is coming into the xylem of the root. Now, from the xylem of the root, and the water would then be pulled by the transpiration and it would go in the stem xylem, and then from here, the water would finally reach the xylem vessels that we have in the leaves, and then water would evaporate here from the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells into the external air spaces, and from here, the water would keep on escaping into the external environment through the stomata. And here, this is a step where the water is going into the external environment from these air spaces. So we were referring to this as the transpiration phenomenon. Now, moving onward, here, before I try to clear your concept of the transportation in plant, here are some of the terms that we need to have a grip on. The first term that we have to recall is osmosis, and we know that whenever the water will move from an area of higher water potential to an area of lower water potential, and that too across a partially permeable membrane that we have here, and that too across a partially permeable membrane, so this would be osmosis. Now, the other thing that we have to be clear about is, so this is a diffusion process. So if I were to have more number of the particles here, so this would be making an area of higher concentration. And if I would have less number of the particles here, so this would make an area of lower concentration. So when the particles they move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration and to down the concentration gradient, so this is what we refer to this as a diffusion. So for the diffusion, there is no obligation of the presence of the cell membrane. And after the diffusion, now here is something referred to as transpiration. So if I have the water molecules here in the air spaces of the spongy mesophyll cells, and if I cause these water molecules to be moving into the external environment, so this is what we would be referring to this as a transpiration, we say. So if I were to be splitting this movement of the water, so firstly, what I would do that I would move the water from the soil into the root hair cells. And then I would move the water from the root hair cells to the root xylem itself. And then from the root xylem, we would be bringing them towards the leaf, and that too with the help of the stem. And we know stem, they have their own xylem with them. And then at the end, we would see that how the water would escape from the air spaces that we have in the spongy mesophyll cells, and finally how it would be going into the external environment. Now, the situation is that here we have got the diagram of the root hair cell, and you see that in the root hair cell we have got on the outside, and this is its cell wall. And immediately below the cell wall, here we have its cell membrane, and then at the center we have got this large vacuole with us. We have the large vacuole with us. Now the situation is that on the outside of the root hairs, what we have with us, so the here lies the soil, and in the soil what we have with us, so these are the water molecules, and then along with that we have got the ions in the soil as well. Now, the water would say that if you want to take me into the root hair cell, so you firstly need to be reducing the number of the water molecules in this large vacuole, because until or unless if we don't lower the number of water molecules, or if we don't lower the water potential in the large vacuole of the root hair cell, then the water cannot move by the osmosis from the surrounding soil particles into this large vacuole. So now the situation is very simple. These root hair cells, now what they do is that in their cytoplasm they have got in themselves the kind of the organelles, and these organelles they are referred to as, or they are termed as, mitochondria. And these mitochondria they would do the respiration process, and by the respiration process they would make the energy in the form of ATP, and that ATP would be utilized to be moving the ions first. Okay, like ions mean the nitrate ions and the magnesium ions. So these ions they would be moved from the soil and then into the large vacuole with the help of these proteins that we have in the cell membrane, and they are the transport proteins. So the idea is that these ions they move by the active transport. The reason is that these large vacuole they already have got more number of ions as compared to the soil particles, and despite that, if I am moving the ions from the lower to the higher concentration, so for that the active transport would be utilized. Now once we have moved the ions into the large vacuole, so they would automatically lower the water potential or the number of the water particles that we have in the large vacuole of the root hair cells, and in that way the water potential in the surrounding soil this would increase. And as a result of that, the water would now move with the help of the osmosis, and then it would come into this large vacuole of the root hair cell. So if I were to be describing these points, so here comes a note that prior to the water movement by the osmosis into the root hair cells, the water potential within the roots has to be lowered. And how this would be lowering? The concept is simple, that the mitochondria that we have in the root hair cells, so they release energy in the form of ATP, and that move the ions from the soil into the root hair cells, and that too of the large vacuole of the root hair cell. And by that they would reduce the water potential in them, and automatically the water potential would now increase in the soil, and then the water with the help of osmosis would move from the higher water potential in the soil to the lower water potential that we have in the large vacuole of the root hair cell, and this would be the osmosis. Now moving onward, now what we have to do is that I have got the water here into the large vacuole of the root hair cell, and now I have to move them toward the root xylem. So in between the root hair cell and the xylem that I have got in the roots, and between them we have got this layer coming, and this would have the cells in them, and these cells they are the cortical cells, or they are the cortex cells with us. Now when the water would move in this area, so it would be by two mechanisms, by the diffusion and by the osmosis. Now when the water would move from the root hair cell from cell wall to cell wall of the cortex cell, so here the diffusion of the water is taking place. But at the same time, when the water would move from the root hair cell's cytoplasm into the cytoplasm of the cortex cells that we have in between the vascular bundle of the root and the root hair cell, so this would now be referred to as osmosis. So from the root hair cell to the root xylem, the water is moving by two mechanisms, by the osmosis that is being done from the cell wall to cell wall, and by the osmosis when the water would move out of the large vacuole into the cytoplasm, and then it would go on and keep to be crossing the cell membrane. So here the osmosis is taking place. Now we have the water where? Here in the xylem that we have for the root. Now we have to take it to the leaf. So this means that from the root xylem, now the water would go into the stem xylem. Now here an issue is coming. Like if I have to be moving the water from the stem xylem to the leaf xylem. So we have to be understanding a little kind of a technicality here. And the technicality is that I have to move the water from the root xylem into the stem xylem, and then I have to take them toward the leaves. But the idea is that the gravity is working downward and water has to be pulled upward. So this is an issue. And unlike us, the plants, they do not have the heart in them. So this means they do not have any kind of the pump to be pumping the water upward. So the water has to be pulled from the stem xylem. So this means that here there has to be some force working, and that force should be keeping the water potential level very low in the leaves, so that would allow the water to be continuously being pulled upward. So the mechanism here that is working, so this is the transpiration mechanism. So this transpiration, when this would be occurring, so this would be pulling the water molecules up the xylem in the stem, and then it would bring it toward the leaf. So if we were to understand that how come the water would move in the stem, so we have to be clear about our concept of the transpiration, we say. So let us quickly try to see that where transpiration is. Now this diagram you people would have got very much aware of, that here in the leaf we have the spongy mesophyll layer, and in the spongy mesophyll layer we have the spongy mesophyll cells, and in the spongy mesophyll cells here we have the abundant air spaces. And in the abundant air spaces, the water would actually diffuse out of the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells. And when the water would be present here in the air spaces, and when it would diffuse into the external environment, so this is what we refer to this as a transpiration process. And this transpiration process is basically be producing a transpiration pull off a scenario that would be pulling the water up the xylem that we have got in the stem. So if I were to tell you that what do we mean by the transpiration thing, so whenever there would be the loss of the water from the air spaces that we have here in the spongy mesophyll cells, and when we would take them into the external environment, so this is transpiration, and you see that when the water is escaping from these air spaces into the external environment, so this is again diffusion. This is not osmosis because we have got no cell membrane coming in the way. So now we have to be understanding is that how do this transpiration would be pulling the water that we have here in the stem soil. Okay, so if you were to just consider this situation, so this part where I have got one of the spongy mesophyll cell being shown, and here we have got the leaf xylem, so something is happening here. So if you were to see it clearly, and this would be in context of that how the water would go from the leaves into the external environment by the way of the transpiration. So the situation that we have to create is that here we have got a cell of the spongy mesophyll cells, and in these cells at the center we have this large vacuole with us, and this large vacuole has a water, and the water would move into the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells, and from here the water would evaporate. Why I'm saying evaporate? Because the water within the cell wall is in the liquid form. And when this would be going into the air spaces that we have in the spongy mesophyll cells, so the water changes its state from being liquid into the gaseous form. So we say that here the water would evaporate from the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells. And as a result, the number of the water molecules that we have in the air spaces in the spongy mesophyll cells, so here the amount or the concentration that we have got for the water molecule, this would increase. And for sure, the water would now escape into the external environment with the help of a transpiration process. Now, this means that when I would pull the water molecules from here to here, in the external environment, so in the air spaces, the water level would fall, and that water would be continuously being compensated from being evaporated from the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells, and that means that this would lower the water potential here in the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells. In order to compensate that, the water would now move from the large vacuole into the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells, and the water potential would now get lower in the large vacuole of the spongy mesophyll cells, and that would now allow the water to be moved from the leaf xylem into the large vacuole of these spongy mesophyll cells. And when the water is moving from here to here, so ultimately in these leaf xylem, the water potential would be lower. And that would now cause the water to be pulled up the stem. And here you see the driving force behind this is transpiration. Because if the transpiration would not occur here, then automatically the water would not be pulled from here to here and here to here. The water would not come, and ultimately water would not come from the leaf xylem to the large vacuole of the spongy mesophyll cells, and we cannot pull the water upward. So if I were to be telling you or mentioning you these points, so how you have to start is that the water is present in the leaf xylem. So here it is the water that we have got. And where does this move? This move into the large vacuole of the spongy mesophyll cells. And from there, where it would go into the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells. And then the water that we have got in the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cell, now this would evaporate into the air spaces that we have got within the spongy mesophyll layer. As a result, when the water lies here, so now the water molecule they would evaporate from the cell wall into these air spaces, and now the water molecule they would diffuse from the air spaces into the external environment, and this would be creating the transpiration pull to be pulling the water up the xylem that we have in the stem, and the water automatically would now be coming toward the leaf even against the pull of the gravity or downward effect of the gravity that we have got in the external environment. So if I were to summarize this, so what you have to say is that in the leaf the transpiration would decrease the water molecules within the air spaces that we have in the spongy mesophyll cells layer, and then the water would be pulled from the xylem of the leaves, and then that xylem of the leaves would now pull the water from the stem xylem, and here the pull is a transpiration pull that is acting. Now we would justify that how come the water would move up the stem. So one thing is that the effect that is causing the water to be pulled up is a transpiration pull, but here we have to make sure that the water molecules within the stem xylem they should be moved upward and to continuously. So this means that some attractive forces they must exist in between the water molecules, and at the same time the water molecule should also be attracted to the cell walls or the surrounding walls that we have for the xylem vessels, and that would bring about the continuity by which the water molecules have to be pulled upward. So what we say is that within the stem, these water molecules they are attracted to one another with the help of cohesive forces. And the water molecule they are attracted toward the surrounding walls of the xylem vessels with the help of the adhesive forces, and that would allow the transpiration pull to be pulling the water upward in the form of a continuous stream. So if I were to say this, so we would simply say that in the stem xylem, the adhesive forces they would cause the water molecule to be attracted to the surrounding cellulose cell walls that we have in their surrounding wall, cellulose cell wall, and the cohesive forces they would keep the water molecules attracted to each another, so that would allow the water to be pulled continuously upward in the form of the single stream, and the water is being pulled up with the help of the transpiration pull, we say. Now, if I were to quickly tell you that what are those factors that would be affecting the transpiration, so it would be the temperature, then we have this light intensity, then we have the speed of the wind with us, and then we have got this humidity with us. The idea is that more temperature we will have, so the water molecules that we have here in the air spaces of the spongy mesophyll cells, so for sure their kinetic energy would be more and they would intend to be moving out into the external environment through the stomata quickly. The other thing is the light intensity. More light intensity we will have, more transpiration we will have. The reason is because the light intensity have an impact on opening the stomatas that we have in between the guard cells. And more guard cells when they would open up, then ultimately more water would escape out, and thanks partly to the more light intensity being created. The other factor that we have in terms of the determining the rate of transpiration, so this is the speed of the wind. Now, if I were to say that here we have got the external air, and in the external air we have these water molecules, and these water molecules they are available within the air spaces which we have in the spongy mesophyll cells. So they are moving outward with the help of transpiration. Now, in the external environment, if I increase the speed of the wind, so these water molecules that have just escaped outside, they would be moved very faster, or they would be moved very quicker away from these spaces that we have in the guard cells. So that would increase the transpiration, because more fastly when we try to be removing the water molecules in the external air with the help of the greater speed of the wind. So a steeper concentration gradient would be existing here, and that would compel the water molecules to be lost by the transpiration more. And now here we have the last factor that have an impact on determining the rate of transpiration, and we refer to this as the humidity, we say. What humidity is, that how much of the water vapors or the water content I have in the external environment. So this is referred to as the humidity. Now if I were to show you a situation, that here you see that in the air spaces of the spongy mesophyll cells, I have got these, you could say, 8 molecules of the water. And here in the external environment, I have got the 5 molecules of the water. Comparative to this situation, where I have got more number of the water molecules on the inside of the leaves, and here I have got very less number of the water molecules in the external environment. So if I were to be talking in context of the humidity, so here in this example, the humidity is high because comparative to the inside of the leaves in the external environment, we have got more water molecules. So here the concentration gradient steepness is less, so automatically the water would be lost less as compared to this situation where we have a low humidity in the external environment and having less water molecules here compared to more water molecules in the air spaces that we have in the spongy mesophyll cells. So here the water loss into the external environment or the transpiration would be more compared to this. So if I were to summarize it, more humidity there is in the external environment, more water molecules we have in the external environment, and the concentration gradient would be less and the water loss would be less by the transpiration. If in the external environment the humidity is less, so for sure the water molecules are less, and that would mean that now we have got a kind of a more steeper concentration gradient in between the air spaces in the spongy mesophyll cells and the external environment. So the water loss would be more or the transpiration would be more when the humidity is less in the external environment. Let us just quickly see that what advantages this transpiration have for the plants. The first advantage is that since the plant, they do not have any kind of a pump or the heart in them as we humans have. So this transpiration would actually pull the column of the water that we have in the stem, and automatically the water and ions they would be pulled by the transpiration, and ultimately they would reach to the reach to the cells that we have in the leaves. And by this, the plants they would not only receive the water, but they would also receive the ions. Now, what advantage do we have in context of the water being brought to the leaves by the transpiration? Because this will keep the cells of the leaf turgid, and the cells they would maintain their shape, and the plant overall would also remain upright. And we know that this water is also a raw material that would be utilized for the photosynthetic process. How the ions that are brought by the transpiration to the leaves are important because the nitrate would be brought about by this and they would help the plant leaves to be making the amino acids and the proteins out of it. And the magnesium ion that would reach to the leaves by the transpiration, so they would help them to be making the chlorophyll in the chloroplast. And ultimately, you see that when from the cell wall of the spongy mesophyll cells, when the water molecules would evaporate out, so they would help to cool down the plant. So these are the advantages that we have got for the transpiration situation. So I hope you would be clear with understanding that how come the water they move in the xylem and that too under the impact of the transpiration pull.